Welcome, everybody. Good morning. It's Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. Today I'm going to go over some of my favorite books about evolution. I've been getting several emails from people really since quarantine started. Several parents have asked me kind of what they recommend for their students that are now studying at home. Like, what should they read about evolution? Which books are the best, and also which videos are the best. So I might do a second maybe next month or so. I'll go over some of the best things on YouTube to watch about evolution. But I want to really highlight this book right here, Evolution in Minutes. I'm going to go over 10 different books, but this is the one that I recommend everybody have because, well, I'll show you why this is so useful when I get to this book on the list here today. But this really this has been the most useful thing that I own. I mean, I don't know if this would be the best book to start if you really know nothing about evolution, but this is really an essential thing to have if you really want to understand evolution in depth. And it almost sounds silly that I'm saying that because it's Evolution in Minutes. And if you flip through this book, it's just a bunch of really short articles about different topics in evolution. But I'll explain why this is such a good book here in a few minutes. But I just want to start off by actually showing you something on YouTube that's really good for an introduction if if you're trying to get a really good basic overview of evolution that gives you a little bit more depth in how complex structures evolve. There is this really wonderful video series of lectures that Richard Dawkins did at the Royal Institution. He did their Christmas lectures there back in the 90s. And this is kind of like Dawkins before he was so... This was before he started writing all of his atheist books and stuff. And he was very much just focused on biology back at that time. And there's 5 lectures. Each of them's an hour long. And he has these really cool experiments that he does on stage. He's got there's a guy that works for the institution there that's actually designed them, and it is really, really good. Dawkins has a lot of books that I'm not gonna. I will be going over one of his books today, but he has a lot of books that are a little bit more technical than what you would probably want to read when you're just doing an introduction to evolution, when you're trying to really start to digest this for the first time. He's got The Selfish Gene and Ancestor's Tale and Climbing Mount Improbable. In this lecture series, he goes over really the best parts of those books. He talks about those in this series of lectures, and it's really, really easy to understand. This was the first thing that I saw that actually it made me decide that I wanted to teach evolution. It was this series of videos, and Dawkins now is a lot more focused on atheism, and he's I went to a conference of his several years back when I first started Stated Clearly, actually, and it was just about atheism. It was really disappointing because I wanted to go there and learn about biology, but his older stuff is really, really good on biology. And so I actually recommend going through that before you start digging through his books, and actually even as kind of your first introduction to evolution. Of course, you should watch the Stated Clearly animations as well. Those are especially designed to give people an introduction when they have no background in biology. But so with that, let me start talking about some of these books here. Let's see. Someone says, baby Dawkins. Yeah. It really is fun to watch his older stuff there. I will be posting links. I'll do in the video description. I will post links to all of these books and to that Richard Dawkins series there. Let's see. So, all right. So getting started here, I have the first 3 books that I want to talk about are sort of introductions to evolution. So if they're really good for if you're just getting started on this topic, and so if your students are just getting started on this topic, your kids or you, these are really good introductions, and they're kind of all in the same vein. One is by Jerry Coyne. It's called Why Evolution is True, and it's great. It talks a lot about it. It's a general overview, and all three of these books are. They're general overviews that go over the fossil record, they go over genetics, they go over different lines of evidence for evolution, and a little bit of the history of thought in evolutionary science. The other one is the Greatest Show on Earth, which is by Richard Dawkins, and it's his attempt later on in his career to make something that's more approachable for the general public. And then I love both of these books, but they are both peppered with little jabs at Christianity. And so if you are coming from a religious background or you are religious, I actually don't really recommend those two, but Jerry Coyne or Richard Dawkins, because they're kind of filled with those little jabs, it's just a little bit distracting, I think, if you come from a religious background. This book right here, Evolution, The Triumph of an Idea, by Carl Zimmer. This is really, really good. You really can't talk about evolution without addressing creationism. There is a well-funded, very active movement that's trying to, promote anti-science. I mean, it's fairly rare in the world of science to have like an organization like creationism that's doing this. We do have a similar thing happening with climate science. There's well-funded anti-climate science kind of program going on. There's another thing with vaccines and so on, but you can't talk about evolution without mentioning creationists and talking about that. But Carl Zimmer does this in a really respectful way, and his work is great. I don't know if you've seen him elsewhere, but he does a lot of stuff for National Geographic. He's actually a journalist. He's not a researcher. So Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins were both researchers earlier on in their career. Jerry Coyne was a researcher his entire career. I believe he's retired now. I might be wrong, but Carl Zimmer he's a journalist, and he has a very, very broad understanding of evolution. It's unique. A lot of researchers, they'll spend all of their time, all of their focus on just a few tiny spots in the field. But as a journalist, he's been exposed to everything in the field of evolution. He's met with all sorts of people, and his stuff is really, really good. So I definitely recommend, all three of those books are really good, but I would recommend Carl Zimmer's, especially if you come from a religious background. We're getting quite a few questions here. I'm getting a recommendation for Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin. I have not read that one. I hear that's really good. But yeah, that I have seen. He has a video series that's on. It's online for free. It's through Biointeractive, and it kind of goes over his book, which is really neat. He's the guy who discovered Tiktaalik, which is this transitional fossil showing what animals were like in the transition between water and land. And he has a book that he'd written about that, and he did a TV series. So I've seen the TV series. It's really good. For those of you who want something a little bit more technical, I talked about Jerry Coyne a little bit earlier. He has a technical book written for... he'll tell you that this is written for scientists, and it's not really meant for the general public. But I love this book, Speciation. It talks about, really, the thrust of this book is how do we define a species and how do we differentiate species from each other. And this, he is talking to the field. There's been a lot of debate as to how to do this ever since, well, before Darwin, really. I mean, when Linnaeus was trying to figure out how to classify organisms, he was struggling with this. Darwin struggled with this. Darwin actually said we shouldn't even bother, because of the way that evolution works. The difference between species is blurry, right? And Jerry Coyne, well, they end up agreeing with that statement a little bit, but he really focuses on, you can. His focus is on animals and animals and things that breed sexually, and he talks about this biological species concept where are different populations able to selectively, or are they able to interbreed or not, and that being a really good criteria. And he likes to focus on that criteria because when the population can interbreed, you have gene flow, and that gene flow really it makes it so that the organisms can't differentiate very much from each other. They stay fairly the same. And so for real speciation to happen, you need to break that gene flow, and that will cause the two lineages to be able to evolve down different lines, and they will differentiate a lot over evolutionary time. But there's a lot of complicated issues involved in this, and this book is really good. Speciation by Jerry Coyne, and like I said, he says that it's for scientists, but I love that book. I love that book. I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in that topic. Endless Forms Most Beautiful. This is by Sean B. Carroll, and in this book he talks about Devo, so evolutionary development. It's where we're studying embryos and genetics to try and figure out how big morphological changes happen. And this book is now a little bit old. There's a lot more that's happened in that field of evolutionary research, but this is still, I would say, still the best overview of that field. And I mean, everything that he's saying in here is still fully legitimate. It's just that there's a lot more stuff now that we now understand. If you really want, a lot of the books that I've showed you so far are basically they're kind of like, they're classic books where it's mostly text and a few images here and there. But really, evolution is a visual science. You're looking at fossils, you're looking at organisms, and it's really kind of frustrating to read a description of a bone or a description of an organism when you could just look at a picture. And so I recommend, getting a textbook on evolution if you really want to be able to understand it well. And my favorite one is this one. It's by Carl Zimmer, and it's called The Tangled Bank. And that is really good. I mean, it's just full of great visuals. It's classic textbook style, but it's Carl Zimmer, so it's written in a way that is just super enjoyable to read. So I really like this book, The Tangled Bank, and it's kind of expensive, but it does a lot more than these typical books where you're just trying to read it and there's no visuals, but there's a lot of chunks of the text that are just describing what an organism looks like and how its body parts function, or trying to describe a skeleton. It's a lot better to have just the images there. This book, Dinosaurs, How They Lived and Evolved, is by Darren Naish and Paul Barrett. And Darren Naish is the one who did the book Evolution in Minutes, which I'll be focusing a lot on here today. But this book, this is the first edition that I have. He's got a new edition out now, some different cover and everything. But this book is really cool if you care about dinosaurs, and it just talks about their evolution, where dinosaurs came. Oh, look, he signed it for me. I actually got this from him when I went to his conference in England, the Tetsu conference. But this is a really, really good book. it's until I read this, I had no clue how much we knew about dinosaurs. I thought that dinosaurs were just kind of like there's the 15 or so different species that you learn about when you're a kid. There's T-Rex and Triceratops and so on. But the amount of information that we know about dinosaurs is insane. We understand what came before dinosaurs, where dinosaurs came from, which groups they came from. And then, of course, there's a lot of stuff in here about the origin of birds coming from dinosaurs. And that is a great book. It talks about the extinction event, all the evidence that tells us about the big dinosaur extinction event and the asteroid hitting and so on. That book is phenomenal if you care about dinosaurs. But again, it's obviously hyper focused on dinosaurs and their evolution instead of evolution in general. If you come from a religious background, or if you are a school teacher and you deal with this with students who have been heavily impacted by the creationist movement, I recommend this book. It's called God's Word or Human Reason, and it's got 3 authors. So Jonathan Kane, Emily Willoughby, and Michael Keesey, and they all come from the creationist movement, and they've since left it. And like I said, it's really amazing how much misinformation there is out there about evolution. And I went to, you've probably seen on this channel, I have a series of videos about the Ark encounter. And when I went to the Ark encounter, I also went to the Creationist Museum. And I met with Nathaniel Jensen. He's a geneticist that works for the Creationist Museum. And so he's one of these people putting out this kind of anti-science propaganda. But I met with him, and he actually gave me a tour of the museum, and it was super interesting. It was really interesting to see how well funded the anti-science stuff is here. And we went behind the scenes, and he was kind of showing me around the office, and there must have been 100 employees there, and all of them are working on publishing articles online that are teaching kids that evolution is fake. They do homeschooling materials, so that teaches that evolution is fake. It is amazing. This is a huge industry. And this is just one of the groups. Answers in Genesis is the group that he works for. It's just one of several groups that full-time, like a staff of at least 100 people, all they're doing is teaching fake science. It is absolutely spectacular. And this book goes over that. These were people that were in that movement and have since left. And they go over and they talk about, they address the concerns, or they address the things that creationists are teaching, and they debunk them very, very thoroughly, and in a way that's extremely respectful, because all of these people were in it at one time. And I really love this book because if you've not been raised with young earth creationist material, you have no clue what, and you're a teacher, or you just have no clue what your students have been taught. And this book will give you a really good idea as to what's going on in the creationist movement and how to deal with a lot of the misinformation that they teach there. So I highly recommend this book for that reason. God's Word or Human Reason. And it also goes over, it's just a good book that goes over, and it's textbook style. It's got a lot of graphics in there, and it goes over evolution in a really good way. I mean, if you just wanted an introduction to evolution, this is actually a good way to go. This it talks about genetics, it talks about fossil record, it talks about everything. Another good one. It's a lot bigger read than some of the others that I've shown. There's a lot more involved here, but it's really good. Next on the list is just a really cool one. It's called Unnatural Selection. This is by Katrina van Grouw. She's an artist, and this is just filled with her drawings. Amazing drawings. And her writing about the different animals that she's depicting here. Sorry, I'm really bad at showing books on screen. But this is my first show and tell. A lot of skeletons, and this book focuses. This is her second. I think this is her second book in this series. But this one focuses just on what we've done with selective breeding to different animals. And I really like this book because she's kind of reviving an old lost art form where, back before there was good photography, back before there was good, color printing and so on. A lot of scientists, what they would do, a lot of scientists were artists, and they would study these organisms. A lot of the naturalists is what they would call themselves, the naturalists. Like Charles Darwin didn't consider himself a biologist. He considered himself a naturalist. And Darwin himself wasn't he didn't do a whole lot of drawing, but other naturalists, they spent a lot of their time studying specimens and drawing them. And those drawings would then be printed in books. And so that's how you learned about science back then. There's Robert Hooke has a really good one on micrographia, where he looks through a microscope and draws all the different things that he's seeing. And that was a game changer in the world of science. It's just we got a guy who can look in a microscope, a really well designed microscope, and he can draw for us what he's seeing. And that's how science used to work. And Katrina does this in a modern way that's super cool. And not only is her art amazing in here, but she shows some of the craziest things that we have done through selective breeding. And she writes about it in the context of evolution. And it's really cool to see how this all works through her mind and through her eyes, what she's seeing here and the things that she points out. This is a really good book. It's been one of my favorite little pastimes to just go through. I haven't actually read this start to finish. It's one of the things that I thumb through a lot and read here and there. It's really cool. Super good. And if you have kids that are in quarantine right now and they're bored and they need projects, like, you could kind of get some inspiration from this and have them make their own little like visual journal of scientific notes about the plants and animals you have around your house, your pets and your plants in the garden and so on. So that's a cool book. There's a lot to be inspired with there. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk about this book here. So Evolution in Minutes is my favorite book. It's definitely the most useful book that I have, because you get to a point when you've read so many things on a topic where almost everything that you're reading is a rerun. And if you're reading a book that needs to be read from start to finish, you just get bogged down in parts that you're reading stuff you already know. This book, it's got about 100 different topics in here. So it's about, there's every major chunk of fossils is talked about. It's got its own little article. Here's an article on symbiosis, the human genome, and they're all extremely short articles. They're like 1 page, maybe 2 pages, sometimes 3, but they're all very short, and they go over everything you could think of. So metabolism and evolution, punctuated equilibrium, evolutionary radiations, the Darwin debate, niche differentiation, plants and the struggle for existence. I mean, we just go on and on and on. And the reason I love this is that there's so many good resources online now that what you can do is you take a book like this. That's Darren Naish. He is what I would consider a true expert in the field of evolutionary biology. And what I mean by that is that he has an extremely broad understanding of the field. His particular field is he's done a lot of work in paleontology, especially focused on dinosaurs. But he has a very good broad understanding of the field, and he knows what we know. He knows what we don't know, and this book is just every single topic you could imagine that you would need to understand. You know, if you're teaching evolution, if you're a high school teacher, pretty much every question that a student is ever going to come up with, it's addressed in here. It's addressed super briefly, but what I do is I'll read through this book, and every time I find something that I really think is interesting. So here's the handicap principle, and signaling theory, which is an important part of evolution and sexual selection and so on. You know, I'll come across this, I'll see that this is an interesting topic, and then I'll go and I'll do a deep dive online, and I'll find, you know, I'll go to the Wikipedia article, I'll go to the research that this stuff is based on, and I'll really do a deep dive. And so this is my go-to book for new ideas as to what I should be studying and learning and thinking about. So highly recommend this book. Again, if you get anything, get this one. This is really cool. So that is kind of those are my top 10 books on evolution. I'm curious to know what you think your favorite books are. If you have any that I have not mentioned here, go ahead and do the @stated casually. Make sure to put a space between that, and I'll see you'll be highlighted in orange here for me in the chat. Let me go over here and see in the comments what people have been saying. I'm being asked why I focus so much on evolution. Evolution is just the most interesting thing to me. It is the topic that gets me thinking and gets me excited. So that's why I focus so much on the topic of evolution. Anne Smith. All of those books look huge and heavy. Some of them are heavy, yeah. Physically heavy. I would say the only one that's really heavy in content would be the Speciation is probably the heaviest in content. You know, he's writing to the scientific field. I've got a lot of other textbooks here. You know, I've got textbooks on vertebrates, on microbiology. I actually have 2 entire volumes just on feathers. Well, you see a lot of people comment on this book that I have behind me that's just called Feathers. I like that book so much that I bought the source material for it as well. And so I've got a bunch of these old books where people are just documenting the anatomy of feathers and how they grow on different birds. And yeah, I get pretty nerdy on bird stuff. I used to have a parrot, and I used to work at a wildlife rehabilitation center, and I worked with raptors. I take them around to schools and stuff, and so I'm very, very interested in birds. Trombone 7 says, "Woot! I've read Endless Forms and a lot of God's Word or Human Reason." Thank you, John Barry. You're welcome. Will you debate Mr. not Dr. Kent Hovind? Kent Hovind is kind of that guy is he's pretty much just kind of a washed out creationist. I don't really like doing debates with people that are his level of dishonesty. He will just try and he really is just a misinformation king. Someone like I've done several debates. I did there's online you can find debates that I've done in the past with several different people. Well, I've done some on this channel, but I did one with Steve Gregg, who was he's a radio show host, and that's way back that's like 2012, I think. So if you want to see Little John Perry doing his first debate, that's pretty fun. But I think there are a lot of better people to talk with, people who are actually trying to take this seriously. And Kent Hovind's not taking this stuff seriously. He's just trying to like throw a wrench in people's work, and it's not really, I don't really see any value in that. But yeah, there are some other people out there that are actually trying to be serious about this, and I'm happy to do debates with people like that, and really discussions. I did the debate the other day on should we fund the origin of life, and that was fun because my debate partner there was actually taking this seriously, and he was actually thoughtful about the topic. So let's see. Of these 10, which book would you recommend for a middle school student, high school student, and college student? Really, I recommend Evolution in Minutes to everybody. I recommend Katrina, the Unnatural Selection. I recommend this to everybody as well. Anyone in those topics or in those age groups. As far as middle school and high school, this book is going to be good for both groups because there's so much. This is probably the best way to learn because you've got so much visuals, so many, and he's really covering full ground here. But again, it's a huge book. It's a textbook, so you could assign chunks. A middle schooler probably won't just read the whole thing on their own, but you could assign chunks to them. Endless Forms Most Beautiful is one I definitely recommend to a college student. This is a lot more technical, and it's talking about a very specific field in evolutionary biology. And The Greatest Show on Earth, I think, is good for... would a middle schooler read this? I don't know. Definitely good for high school. Probably good for middle school. And then Evolution, Triumph of an Idea. Also, probably more of a high school level. But this textbook, The Tangled Bank, I think is the one that I would recommend most for the middle school student because there's so much good visuals in here. So. Let's see. Yeah, well, that really summarizes my book review. This is kind of a shorter Sunday morning science, but I could go into depth on each of these books, but I want to reread them right before I do that. So, it's been, for some of these books, it's been years since I read them. One thing to know about Carl Zimmer's book here is that some of his information on whales is very outdated. This book's fairly old. So this was written before we discovered the really strong connection between whales and hippos. And we thought at that time that there was another group of animals in the fossil record that they might be linked to. And so he talks a lot about them. But other than that, this book is super good. It's got, it's actually, you know what? I'm not sure if it's this book where he does, this book actually might be updated. But I do remember after reading this book thinking this was the friendliest, most respectful toward creationists of the intros to evolution that I've read. Again, because Dawkins and Jerry Coyne both kind of spend a fair amount of time poking fun at the religious groups. But yeah, that is a good one. Got a couple more comments here. Is it still considered evolution when we select for characteristics deliberately and consciously? Yeah, I mean, the phenotype is changing, right? The phenotype of an organism is changing. The selective breeding is a type of really rapid evolution that we can cause to happen just through selective breeding. I think once you get into actual genetic engineering, maybe you wouldn't want to call that evolution, but all of the selective breeding that we do nature is the creator of the new genetic information, and we are just selecting for which traits we like and dislike. So it's really, it's still mostly a natural process, even when humans are involved in selective breeding. And there's a lot we can learn from selective breeding, because the natural environment is doing the selective breeding in the wild, and it's just the same thing. You just take the human out of it, and nature's going to do that selecting that the human is trying to do when they're selecting for a dog breed that they like, and so on. So yeah, very, very similar. Oh, I'm being asked to make more videos on the origin of life. I've got a new animation that I'm working on right now for Stated Clearly that will be on that specifically. So yeah, look forward to that. Yeah. So after I close down here, I'm going to be dropping the list of books here in the comment section, and I will send the link to the series of videos by Dawkins that I recommend people watch as well. And those are really, like, that will get you excited to then dig into some of these books, I would say. I'm being asked, what is the best hypothesis of the origin of life? That is, well, that's a topic for another day. I'll have to do another video just on that here on Sunday Morning Science sometime. That gets pretty complex. Being asked, do evolutionary biologists have a falsifiable technique to distinguish homology from homoplasy? This is one of the harder things to figure out when you look at an organism, is trying to distinguish these things. Basically, you have to look at as many lines of evidence as you can to really figure out what you're looking at there. So I guess that would be the method. You just look at lots of different lines of evidence and compare lots of different lines of evidence to try and figure out what you're looking at there. So it looks like that ends the questions that I'm getting on books specifically. So thank you for joining me today. I'll put a list of these books in the comment section and in the video description as well. So long for now. Stay curious.